Welcome to the Faith and Feelings podcast. My name is Taylor Joy, and I'm passionate about helping you untangle and honor your emotions, authentically practice your faith, and integrate both into your everyday life so that you can experience the goodness and delight that comes from living in relationship with yourself, God, and others. Thank you for joining me. Let's get started. Have you ever struggled to name the pain you're experiencing inside? When we don't have language for the pain we carry, we can create other names for it. Names like not good enough, unworthy, broken, or wrong. Many of us often avoid naming and validating our pain out of fear of being overwhelmed by or feeling stuck in it. But what if the opposite is actually true? What if this is actually the first step towards healing? This is what author and therapist Monica DiCristina and I talk about today. Inviting us into her own story, Monica beautifully demonstrates that while not every wound may fully heal, each one can be understood. And that understanding starts when we confront our pain and not just recognize the hurt, but name and honor it. This is such a powerful conversation on ways that trauma can impact our view of God, how to tell the difference between shame and conviction, and what it looks like to sit well with others and ourselves in pain. So let's go to my conversation now with Monica. Well, Monica, I'm so glad to have you on Faith and Feelings today.
I'm so happy to be here.
Well, a quick review for anyone who might be new to Faith and Feelings. So right now we are wrapping up a podcast series on experiencing deeper intimacy with God. And I am so excited to have you on the podcast today, Monica. I started following you on Instagram a couple years ago. And as a therapist in training, I've learned so much from the way you bring writing and therapy together in such a beautiful way. So thank you.
Thank you for saying that. I really, really appreciate that.
Well, to get started today, I'd love to hear some of your story and specifically the formation of your faith journey. So how would you describe your earliest perceptions of God, and who or what would you say shaped this view?
Such a good question. I would say that my earliest perceptions of God were from Catholic confirmation. And everyone has a different experience with that. What my experience was with that was almost like a statue God far away, right, from me. And then as I got more and more interested in spite of my statue feeling. And I was also simultaneously starting to experience a lot of anxiety in my life. And I started to see God as a beacon of hope. Like, I just knew that this God could help me. I just knew that. And I didn't have any fancy language about it. I didn't have anything except for like a deep gut knowing that if I could just run towards Jesus, run towards God, I could be helped. And so that really guided that sort of magnetic attraction to the hope that God brought me, just kind of guided so much of my early formation after that more formal stage.
That's beautiful. I'm wondering, as you got older, have there been any beliefs about God or spirituality that you've had to unlearn on your journey?
Definitely. So I went sort of from a more, the Catholic confirmation process that I was doing. Then I went into more of a non-denominational church sort of setting, and then I went more into a setting where there was tons of quiet times. I don't know if that language was before your time. The quiet times and all the devotionals. I remember it. Yeah. Yes. And so I think what I started to build and had to unlearn was this misconception that I had to earn God's attention. That I had to earn God's help, earn God's love. Even in spite of knowing in my gut God could help me and just running towards Him, I had to unlearn this sort of almost what became a little bit of a formal pressure to spend this much time in prayer, this much time doing this and that. And that was a real freeing to unlearn that.
I think so many of us can relate to that misconception that we have to earn God's attention. It actually reminds me of something that last week's guest, Terry Wardle, described as a performance-based or harsh gospel. So for you, what has the journey of unlearning that belief looked like?
It's a great question. I think part of it was experiencing God in spite of my own perceived failures to check the box that day. You know, and then starting to learn how much bigger God was than my small misconceptions about what I needed to do to earn love or attention. So it was definitely experiential, and learning that God wasn't, this was a big one for me. God wasn't impressed. And this was a freeing idea. It's just like, wow, I mean, it's really, I don't know why I'm trying to impress God with my little devotional. It was a relief.
I'm curious, can you think of maybe a story or memory where you actually began to experience that shift happening inside of you?
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I can't think of that's a great question again. I can't think of a specific moment, but I can think of what it felt like. It felt like freedom. It felt like ease. It felt like staying connected without trying to earn that connection. It felt like feeling and knowing that God was present without me trying to um, marionette or think that I was controlling it. That was a real comfort.
So good. Well, something I've been reflecting on throughout this series is how trauma can shape the way that we actually see and relate to God.
Mm-hmm.
So, from your perspective as a therapist, could you help us understand maybe first, what exactly is trauma?
Mm-hmm.
And then second, how might traumatic experiences influence the way that we come to picture or experience God?
It's such an important question, and I think it's one I really appreciate you asking. I don't think that we're asking that question enough, but trauma is as you know is anything that overwhelms our ability to cope. But it comes from the Greek word that means wound, and so one of the things I think is so important that people may not realize about trauma is it's not the event or the series of events; it's what happens in your body from that event. And so one person may experience trauma from something, but another person may not necessarily experience it or experience it in the same way. And so it's what happens inside of you that is actually the trauma. And I think how this can impact our relationship with God is that any pain that we experience is going to impact our sense of identity and our sense of safety in the world and safety in relationships. And so if you think about the ideas of identity and safety, that's definitely going to impact your ideas about God. Am I lovable? Does God love everyone but me? Can I trust God? Can I trust God to be there when someone else wasn't there for me? So trauma is something that impacts our relationship to everything, our relationship to ourselves, and therefore our relationship to other people and our relationships to God.
That's so good. I'm thinking of Gabor Mate's definition of trauma, which he says is not what happens to us, but what happens inside of us in the absence of an empathetic witness. That phrase, empathetic witness, has stayed with me because, like you just said, trauma is not the event that happens, but what happens inside of us because of our felt sense of aloneness and the lack of attunement or compassionate presence that we experience in it. I've also been reflecting on how our early attachment experiences can shape the way that we come to relate to God. So I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on that connection as well. How do you see early attachment experiences shaping someone's image or experience of God?
Another fantastic question that I feel like that we should do a whole series on this. I mean, if you think about attachment is your first imprint of how relationships work, right? It's like, it's knowing, is someone going to be there when I'm sad? Is someone going to get mad at me if I have a need? Is someone going to think what I'm saying is important? And so we take that first imprint and then we globalize it to all our other relationships. And that does not exclude our relationship with God. We take that first imprint that we had in our first early caregiving relationship and we see God in that way until we learn differently. For some of us, that's a great imprint. It's wonderful. But for many, it's not. For many, it's lacking. And we have to unlearn that.
That's so good. I think oftentimes we are told or we can internalize this message of shame and our own quote unquote badness when God feels distant or unsafe because of our stories or life experiences. So can you speak to the person listening who might feel some of that guilt for this sense of disconnection? And maybe with that, what might a first step towards healing look like?
I have so much compassion for anybody that would resonate with this question, and I definitely have in my life. This sense of badness. What I would first say is that's never the voice of God. God doesn't talk like that. God doesn't sound like shame. And so it's really important for us to distinguish what does shame sound like then. Shame is always an all-encompassing badness. It's that you are just, for reasons we can't fully define, not good enough, bad, other, rejected, unlovable. And that's never the voice of God. Whereas if we're talking about something more specific like conviction, which a lot of people get confused about that's specific. That's like a knife through butter. It's like, I ran the red light. I did not return my library book. It's very specific, whereas shame is all encompassing about your identity. And so if someone listening resonates with that, the first thing I would say is that, again, that's not God's voice. And how we begin to distinguish that is to start to continue to learn, well, what does God's voice sound like? And we can learn about that in lots of different ways, and obviously studying the Bible or listening to people that we trust teach or reading really great books. But when we begin to listen and understand more and more, this is the voice of God, we'll begin to understand more and more that you're bad or you're other, it just isn't God's voice.
It's so interesting that you mentioned shame and conviction. I was actually just thinking about that the other day.
Oh, really? Yeah.
After having a few different conversations about the differences between the two and even how this difference feels in our bodies.
Yes.
So do you have any other thoughts or reflections on how we can begin to differentiate the experiences of shame and conviction?
Yeah. And I think it's so important because I think they can both make us feel bad or they can both make us feel uncomfortable. But I think that conviction leads you back to connection. Conviction is is an understanding. There's almost, I would say, a relief in conviction. Like you can't disagree with it. It's like, you know what? Even if this is going to be hard, this is true. This is true. And it's almost a relief to name it. Whereas shame is like a dark hole. It's like a cloak over you. And it always leads to disconnection. If you're feeling shame, you are going to be shrinking and shrinking and shrinking and thinking that you are unworthy and unlovable. And although we can feel convicted about things that we worry that could happen, it's a very different feeling because there's a specificity. Shame is never specific. It's just all encompassing that somehow I, as a person, am just bad. Is that helpful?
Yes. Yes, that's really good. Well, I know you have a new book coming out tomorrow called Your Pain Has a Name, and it's such a beautiful offering. I'm so grateful for the wisdom and insights you share. I know that one of the things you talk about is your own experience of pain being unnamed for so long. So can you take us back to that season of your life? What did it feel like before you had language for what you were carrying?
Yeah, it was a long season and, it had a lot of shame in it. So, to carry that theme forward, it had a lot of I'm just bad and I don't know why. And I don't know how to fix that. It had a lot of false starts too. I think I have a really big heart for people that are trying to find names for what's going on with them and they keep running into dead ends.
Yeah.
And so I had a lot of those. I had a lot of those in my church experiences as well. And a lot of the people I spoke to were well-meaning, but it was also a different time. There just wasn't enough referring out. There wasn't enough saying, gosh, I've never heard something like this before. I don't know what's going on with you, but I care and I'm going to stick with you until we find someone who does. And so what I would say overall is that it was really lonely. It was so lonely. And I think that that's one thing that when we don't understand what's going on with us and we're running into people who, even if they really care, they also don't understand, it can feel really lonely.
I'm wondering if you might be willing to take us into one of those false starts, maybe even one that happened within a church setting.
Yeah. I mean, one of them that I write about in the book was I with my college roommate who was wonderful and was a perfect example of someone who said, I don't know what's going on with you, but I'm going to stick with you and try to figure it out with you. That's a perfect example of that. We went to see the pastor of the little church we were going to in college. And And we told him what I was struggling with, which, I write about in the book, was an anxiety disorder, was ego, dystonic, intrusive thoughts, which, if listeners don't know, that's a lot of jargon. What that is really scary thoughts that have nothing to do with you, but are really overwhelming and repetitive. And so we went to ask him about this and figure out what was going on. And what strikes me still today was his complete lack of curiosity. He had no curiosity. In fact, he really gave us a sermon, and I would say, and I remember it, even though I don't think it was this way, that he was sitting up here and we were sitting down here, but I think we were probably sitting eye to eye, but it felt like he was just preaching down to us.
Yeah.
And as a full adult, I marvel at that he didn't see two young girls hurting in front of him and think, hey, let me try to find somebody that can help you guys. That he didn't refer me to any mental health, that he didn't even just reach out to us again or reach out to someone else to say, hey, this person's really hurting. He just gave a sermon. And I think that there's lots of different versions of this, where some people give us a sermon. Some people tell us about their supplements or the new book they read, or, or the new Instagram account they're following that solves everything. And what happens is that they don't really hear us. And they also are not comfortable saying, gosh, I care, but I don't know. Which can often leave people feeling really alone, right? I think that happens a lot with mental health issues in particular. It can also happen with physical issues, but with mental health issues, people just don't know. And they don't say, I don't know enough, but I'm going to help you find someone who does.
I love that you just named the importance of curiosity when
Yeah.
sitting with other people in pain and even in areas that we don't know a lot about.
Mm-hmm.
So first, what did it feel like to be on the receiving end of that pastor's lack of compassionate curiosity towards you?
Mm-hmm.
And how might you encourage those of us who are listening to sit well with others?
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, it felt like no hope. That's what it felt like, and I think that that's what I care a lot to bring a message of hope, is because I think a lot of people they go first to faith leaders typically, and it felt just like no hope. But I would say, as far as sitting with others, here's what I would really want all of us to remember, is that sometimes the most helpful we can be is quote unquote unhelpful, meaning that when we feel so much pressure to solve someone's pain, or to quote unquote diagnose it for them, or to tell them what worked for us, which may have nothing to do with their story, we miss them. And so I think so many of us just care, and we're not doing this on purpose, but I think if we gave ourselves more permission just to be with someone rather than solve what's hurting them, I think that we could really show up better for each other and just say, tell me more. What's that like? I didn't know that. What does that feel like? What's worked? What hasn't worked? And just being with that person rather than trying to solve it.
So good. One thing I've been learning lately is that when I feel myself gravitating more towards fixing,
Yes,
I'm often trying to alleviate my own discomfort rather than simply being present with the person I'm with.
exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yes, Taylor, that's it.
Yeah. So I'm learning what it looks like to notice that. And then, like you said, lean into curiosity instead.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's okay that we get uncomfortable. And it's really, as in your work now, it's not easy to sit across from people who are hurting and to not be able to fix it for them. Like, it's really hard. Yeah. And so I think having compassion that we want to get in there and fix it, but pausing and realizing that that's probably not the thing they need most. In fact, if there was a quick fix, they probably would have found it, before
Yes.
before this moment.
So good.
Yeah.
Well, like I said a couple minutes ago, you have a new book coming out called Your Pain Has a Name, and you focus on the importance of naming and validating pain. So why do you think this process of naming and validating is so important in our healing process?
Because I think that it's often what we skip over first. It's like we said, when we're sitting with other people, but also when we're sitting with ourselves, we skip over this part because we're taught to run from pain. We're taught that it's dangerous. We're afraid it will consume us. And the problem with skipping over validation is that then we're often applying solutions to ourselves that are not actually related to what we need. So starting with naming and validating your pain is the first step to help you understand, what do I actually need? If I'm angry, it's going to be different. That I'm going to need something different than if I'm lonely, right? I need to be able to listen and validate what I need. And I think the other reason it's important to do that is when we start to name and validate anything, we're already in the process of separating our identity from that hard thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
We're already saying, wow, this matters and this is painful. And here I am experiencing it. I am not this thing. And I think that that's a really, really grounding, important thing throughout the process.
I love this word validate because I think we can often talk about naming and finding language for our pain, but validating our pain, I think, is so important. So what does it look like to begin validating some of our experiences or what we've been through?
It looks like listening, but I think that what we often think we're doing when we're listening is just judging, when we're just judging how we feel. So it looks like this, back to this great word, curiosity, listening with curiosity to how we're feeling and then allowing it to be true. Now, I think we often think we have to pick, well, I'm either this, or I feel this or this. But oftentimes we may feel a lot of things at the same time. And so just allowing ourselves to listen, not judge it, and then let it actually be true, and it doesn't, and I think the thing is, I think sometimes people get afraid about validating things because they're afraid they're going to have to stay in that feeling forever. And actually it's quite the opposite. Feelings that are validated are more quickly resolve, I'm sure you've heard of that famous term, name it to tame it, by Dr. Dan Siegel, that the part of our brain naming and validating what we're feeling helps soothe the part of the brain feeling the big feelings.
I know we were talking a little bit about this before we started recording, but the process of book writing is a lot.
Yes.
It can be such a beautiful and challenging process. So I'm curious, as you think back to this process of writing Your Pain Has a Name, what have you learned maybe about yourself and your own healing as you've written this book?
Oh, gosh. I mean, I've learned that I can keep going even when I want to give up, because I had many moments like that. But I've also learned the power of, and I think we use this jargon a lot, so I want to unpack it more than the jargony words, but of owning my own story. You don't have to write a book to own your own story, but there is something really freeing to saying, I'm going to allow all the parts of my life be integrated into one. I am also a soccer mom. I am also a business owner and a practicing therapist. And I also have this story that impacted me a lot. And there's a real freedom in allowing all the parts of our lives to coexist together and to hold it together in one way with love and to honor that. So I think that that's been really a really cool experience. And I like that I care so much about mental health and destigmatizing it, and especially in faith spaces. And I think telling my own story has allowed me to speak into that even more. And I've really enjoyed that.
What is your hope that people experience from reading your book?
I would hope that readers experience hope and that they're not alone. The truth is that the frustrating thing I encountered writing this book is that I can't name every pain. It's impossible. In fact, the first draft of the book, I tried to more and it was way too long. And so knowing that I can't name everyone's pain, I hope that people feel empowered to find names for their pain, that my story, other people's stories, specific examples gives them hope to keep going, even if they don't find it in that book. Right. And that there is validation. There is a name for what they're experiencing. And that understanding is so freeing. It doesn't solve pain, as we've talked about. It can't eliminate it, but that understanding is so empowering and so relieving.
Yeah, that's so good. Well, I'm so grateful for your time today, Monica. I'll put the link to your new book in the show notes so listeners can check it out. But thank you for joining me for this conversation today.
Absolutely, Taylor. I loved your questions and I loved hanging out with you. So thank you.
Wasn't that such a beautiful conversation? I've been reflecting on so much from this time with Monica, but one of the things I've been thinking about in particular is the way she differentiated shame and conviction. As Monica emphasized, while conviction leads to connection, shame always leads to disconnection. And while conviction is specific, shame is never specific. Rather, it is an all-encompassing feeling of badness. So as you reflect on these differences, how might shame and conviction feel differently in your body? What physical sensations do you notice? Recognizing the way that shame and conviction show up differently in your body can be another helpful way to differentiate the two. I've linked Monica's new book, Your Pain Has a Name, which comes out tomorrow, in the show notes, as well as the link to my Substack, which is a weekly resource email that I send out every Wednesday. As always, if you'd like to hear more of my thoughts on today's episode, be sure to subscribe. I'd love to have you join this community. I'm so grateful that you listened to today's episode. Thank you for spending time with me. I'd love to hear from you. Connect with me on Instagram at TaylorJoy or through my website, taylorjoymurray.co. Also, if you enjoyed this conversation, it would mean so much to me if you took a minute to subscribe and review the podcast. This is an easy way to partner with me and is invaluable in reaching new listeners. Until next week.